Okay, so shall we begin?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes. So welcome everybody to this final CITYPERC seminar of this season, this particular season, with Giorgos Gouzoulis from Mary, on a topic that is of the moment, because it's about debt and future workers. But what I like is the subtitle, exploitation. Financialization as exploitation in the 21st century. Not many people use the word exploitation in relation to finance and debt. So this is something that's going to be revealing and interesting, and I hope really good basis for discussion. So we're going to begin with Giorgos, followed by remarks from Stefano, and then we'll start Q&A and then debate discussion. So Giorgos, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Many thanks, Flori, for the intro, and thanks to both you and Inga for organizing that. I very appreciate it, and of course to everyone for being here, both online and in person, of course. So, what's the book about? General future of workers. I guess starting with the main premise of the book, the main argument, I guess, is that we cannot understand inequalities, in particular micro-level inequalities, labor market inequality, without understanding properly the macro political economic processes that govern whole economies. And of course, the main process that we're experiencing for the past several decades is financialization, of course. And I guess the closing argument of the book has to do with what we can do about all that, right? So, what's the starting point of my analysis? In the first main chapter of the book, I talk about the literature around the future of work. I've used the term, I think quite popular term, the past 15, 20 years. The main argument of this literature, the main problem they're dealing with is what happens within the workplace and how changes within the workplace shape inequalities, work experience, exploitation. And what's the literature all about? First of all, the growth of the gig, the platform economy, how the experience of workers, different types of inequalities, labor organizing. Of course, the good old literature on globalization, value chains, outsourcing, the segmentation of production, and more recently, after COVID and with the growth of AI in recent years, a lot of discussion about how our workplace have become hybrid and remote, and how digitalization is replacing, and AI now is replacing labor in many different workplaces. So, sort of what's the canon in the literature? Labor economics, sociology of work, anthropology of work, all different subfields deal with this kind of issues. However, if you read closely all these studies, from Marxists to the economists to the FT to political scientists and political economists, you will be wondering, why do they use all those things? These are tools, right? Outsourcing production, trying to cut down costs, intensify work, hire gig workers instead of hiring actual workers. Why do they do all that? And most studies within this subfield, they do not have, in my opinion, a very convincing answer about why do they use all these tools. And if you read all that, you're left wondering, at least I was left wondering after many years of reading all this literature, who get exploited on behalf of whom or by whom and why, right? Why are they using all these ways to cut down costs and intensify work, right? And the answer I try to give in the book is that has to do mainly with financialization, right? What does push managers to implement use all these tools, from shareholder value orientation to securities markets, competition, to the growth of private equity, of course, and even more short, medium-term cyclical dynamics of business and corporate. And all those things create immense financial pressures to managers and corporate governance, which one way or another leads the vast majority of employers, non-financial corporations, and in turn financial corporations to experience some kind of balance sheet imbalance, right? And when it happens, what you need to do is to cut down costs somehow, right? And ultimately, weakest link in any organizational hierarchy, and that is, in most cases these days, workers, right? So one or another, they do use these tools to pass on the costs of corporate financialization onto workers through wage cuts, through work intensification, and other ways as well. But still, the other question that comes into mind after all that is, why do we accept that as workers, right? Why workers across different sectors accept all that? It's a big question. And the answer, to me, the answer I tried to give in this book, particularly in chapter 3, where I explain that in more detail, is that what explains that is the rise of the financialization of our everyday lives, right? More recent literature than the whole discussion, the debates around corporate financialization. What is that all about? So what we have been experiencing over the past 3-4 decades is really historically unique, right? So we had, after World War II, great expansion of government spending in many countries. So you had a very unique situation, despite it's commonly described as the golden age of capitalism. That was actually the result of government investment and inter-regime competition, ultimately, right? So very unique situation. You had mass deaths, so that means low labor supply globally. You had destruction across the world, infrastructure, housing, industry. All this had to be rebuilt. So very unique situation, a very tight labor market, the tightest labor market perhaps historically. And at the same time, you had all this competition between the East and the West. And to, of course, suppress any revolutionary intentions in the West and the East, to kind of halt migration, people escaping to the West. Both sides of the wall increased welfare spending, ultimately, to kind of suppress all that. But of course, at some point, both Reconstruction ended, but the baby boom was worse, so the labor market, labor supply expanded dramatically. And at the same time, of course, the Eastern Bloc fell eventually. So there was really no reason to keep spending that much on the state side. So we turned to good old free market capitalism, and even worse, we started privatizing. Governments couldn't privatize anything. So what is historically unique about the situation? Of course, we did have housing booms in the past, the 1929 crisis, very similar to Central Netherlands, very similar to the 2008 crisis. But what is substantially different is this shift from financing just housing and corporations. Now the financial system, all types of financial institutions are funding anything from education to healthcare, transportation, even payday loans in many countries that this is allowed. So that is reflected in this upward trend that we see, especially in the UK and the US, which again has no historical precedent. If you look at long run data that are available, more Surrey Taylor's database, for example, you would see that we've never had such an expansion in household credit ever before in history. What it means for work and resistance, returning to the starting point of the previous discussion about cutting down costs and intensifying work, that having a work contract and servicing of it have become interlinked. And what does that really mean? You enter a debt agreement with the bank, with the credit provider. You agree for a specified period of time to repay a certain amount of debt. So for this period, you need to have a steady flow of income, right? You need not to lose your job. And in the current environment, asking for more building work comes with the hyperability of losing your job. A very deregulated labor market, labor rights are violated across the world constantly. And there's a threat of relocation, of course, which means that we're more vulnerable than ever before. And this unique situation, challenges one of the core assumptions of standard mainstream labor market models. Which, if you look at micro-level models of the labor market, even today, what they do is they have a function that maximizes, at the same time, employment stability, wages, working conditions. There's no trade-off between the three. But based on what I just described, what actually happens these days is that there is a trade-off between the two. Asking for better pay, better working conditions comes with a high risk of losing a job. So employment stability in the current environment means to accept worsening work conditions or even stagnant or declining pay to keep your job and be able to repay your debt. So what's the main premise of the book, I guess, after this theoretical part is concluded in chapter 3, that to understand exploitation under financialization is not just about understanding who owns the means of production, but it is equally about who owns the means of financing. Both things, right? Which again, kind of historically unique situation. But now let's try to understand how this works in practice. What happens in practice? And the first step, of course, what happens with unions? So in chapter 4, I discussed unions, but I mainly focus on the steep decline in unionization of the past 4 or 5 decades. One of the key stylized facts of labor markets globally over this period. So how do we explain that? Again, conventional explanations center on globalization, technological improvements that lead to whatever labor-saving investment strategies, so to speak. But again, the driving force behind all that, in most cases, all these again are tools, right? What is causing all that? What's the driving force? Is again, on the one hand side, corporate financialization. So what do we see now? More and more studies show over the past 15, 20 years that this literature exists, that financialized corporations use extensively union busting as a cost-cutting strategy to deal with financial pressures. So what they do in practice, they lobby larger corporations, lobby governments, local governments, or central governments to liberalize the law around unions, anti-union law. They threat or actually relocate production in low unionization or non-unionized regions and countries. And they also engage in what is described as strategic hiring. So hiring on purpose non-union members to avoid strengthening their workplace unions, right? And there's a lot of leadership on all that, but also it's all over the news. If you look at recent news, it's all over. Union busting through firing for different corporations, different sectors. They do engage in that a lot. Now, the household, the worker financialization side, I don't know this idea that just described before, that perhaps a low-paid, poor working condition job is safer for an indebted worker because it's more desirable, more appealing to employers. A non-unionized job might be a financially safer, more stable option for a indebted worker. Having a low-paid job with bad work conditions provides less incentives to employers to outsource the job, firing it, right? And again, that might sound like a far-fetched assumption, but again, there's literature about all that. A couple of years now, several studies show empirically that. And again, all over the news, I'm not sure if you have followed news around these things, but workers voting against unionizing across different sectors, different firms. It's quite shocking, right? Working conditions deteriorating, and people, instead of fighting back and organizing, they do. And the answer, to a great extent, as explained in chapter 4, has to do with the pressure of corporate financialization, the financialization of our everyday lives. Now, so what happens with unions, with strikes in an environment where unions are so disempowered, right? Of course, fewer strikes. We know that quite well now, with the exception of the COVID period 2-3 years ago. There were kind of a wave of strikes. In general, since 1969, this data from the ILO, so this chart of the data set, we have the lowest strike activity over this whole period. Why? Because unions are disempowered, fewer organizers, fewer financial resources due to lack of members to support strikes, so less strikes are organized. When strikes are are organized, fewer people are participating. Again, why is that? Participating in a strike in the current environment comes with a higher risk of becoming replaced. And being replaced with your job means that you will end up defaulting very soon, right? So fewer people are willing to participate in strikes when these are organized. And when a strike is organized, actually, when some workers decide to join the strike, these strikes are very short. They won't last more than a few days or a couple of weeks these days. Again, going on strike under the same logic involves a direct loss of income, right? When you're on strike, you don't get paid, which means that every single day, every additional day that you're striking, you're coming one step closer to missing payment on your mortgage or your credit cards and end up defaulting, losing your home or any other healthcare, anything else you're funding through your debt. So that's what I describe in chapter 5 of the book as dead force industrial peace against a quite extensive literature that tries to depict that as a more positive situation, that workers are not that militant anymore because we have better working conditions than we used to in the past, surprisingly. All pieces of the puzzle together, disempowered unions, strikes happening not very often, with just a few people participating just for a few days or a few weeks, so not a great situation in terms of labor militancy. What happens to work and inequalities? And in the next chapter of the book, what I'm trying to make is a case to look at the good old concept of the reserve army of labor. That comes from Marx and Engels, of course, but from a slightly different angle. What makes workers more precarious these days, right? What can explain all this picture of high unemployment and underemployment, precarious work? And the answer lies once again back to, of course, the pressures of financialization. So from the corporate side, more flexible jobs or more appealing jobs for employers, more flexible. Once you have some kind of financial pressure that you're facing as a corporate manager, what you do is, of course, you can reduce the work hours of your part-time employees or just not renew your fixed-term contract. So it's very convenient as opposed to offering full-time jobs. And at the same time, workers, of course, for the same reasons that I described before, these jobs might be more appealing because you know that employees prefer the supply of the job is greater, and they do prefer to hire people under these contracts. And of course, we have a dramatic shift in long-term unemployment, which is also to a significant extent related to the shift of non-financial corporation profiting from financial process, whatever Greta Krippner described like 20 years ago as this profiting from financing, or Gouzoulis has described similar things in his book several years ago. But at the same time, what does financialization, this process I described before, mean for labor market competition? Is it just precarious people and the unemployed that are competing with each other for jobs? And the answer is no. There is a significant part of the population that already has a job and is looking for a second job. Why? Because it's safer to avoid losing your job. Instead of negotiating for a higher pay to repay whatever debts and risking becoming redundant, just get a second job. And these are data for the US, because they have, they're more granular than in other countries, but the trend is common across advanced economies. So what you can see here is the top, the number of people having two part-time jobs, so people cannot find have more safe contracts. You have at the bottom people having one full-time and one part-time job, so people taking on a second part-time job to deal with whatever financial difficulties. But in the middle, the dotted line is people in the US where this is allowed, that have two full-time jobs at the same time. And you can see towards the end, the last few years, how this is rising. So all this process of financialization is intensifying competition in the labor market dramatically, more than ever before. So not just the unemployed and underemploying, competing with each other for a good job, but even full-time permanent workers looking for additional jobs at the same time. And if you take all that into account, that does explain, as explained towards the end of this chapter, the decline of the global labor income share to a significant extent, right? So you're having corporations passing on through all these different ways the cost of corporate financialization onto workers, and workers accepting lower and lower wage to do the same job to avoid unemployment, right? And we see this quite dramatic decrease, one of the most well-established stylized facts about the labor markets these days. But of course, that's aggregate level, right? It's the whole labor market, the whole workforce. And it is interesting that financialization doesn't just do that. It also affects significantly differences between different social groups, different sectors. What we also observe over the past few years is the growth of the finance wage premium. So workers in finance, employees in finance, get salaries that are 2 to 4 times higher than the average worker outside finance. And of course, if you think about financialization, the essence of all that is that a reallocation of resources from the non-financial sectors to the financial sectors, which means that financial, insurance, real estate corporations can afford higher salaries than corporations outside finance, or at least when they need to cut down wages, they need perhaps to cut down this less than the rest of the economy. So that results in a huge gap between the two. Of course, the growth of, at the same time, the growth of managerial bonuses and stock options, managers implementing all these wage cuts, they're getting rewarded through bonus payments for improving financial performance, CEOs having stock options, and others also benefit a lot, as you can see from the figure there, from the whole process. And finally, at the same time, what financialization does very well, especially the financialization of households, is to exploit pre-existing inequalities, right? So what do we see is also that this whole discussion around credit scores and the biases around from determining who is credit worthy and who isn't is deepening, crucially, inequalities between different racial, ethnic, and gender groups. All these pay gaps between men and women, black and white workers in the United States, for example, or other ethnic minorities across the world are growing to a great extent because of the biases that emerge through the process of the financialization of everyday lives. So this sounds quite grim. So the question is, what do we do? Can we do anything about all that? So that's, I guess, the closing chapter. I'm trying to engage with this question: what can we really do about all that? And the discussion here starts with the question of legality versus power. And the first obvious question, not obvious, but maybe the discussion is personal debt illegal, right? And the answer is yes. If you look at all different treaties, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN, the World Health Organization, the Constitution, and other civil and political rights, covenants, you will come up, as explained in the book, with one conclusion: that the access to housing, healthcare, transportation, food, education, water are all fundamental human rights. And all people have massive access to all those things, regardless of socioeconomic status. And if you read closely all the clauses and explanations, you will come up with the same conclusion I explained in the last chapter of the book, that anyone who's imposing barriers to access to this thing is violating fundamental human rights. So in this regard, profiting from providing credit for all those things is illegal. But so it doesn't matter, right? Because we live under capitalism. Okay, so the law is a creation, is influenced and shaped by the economic elites. Its interpretation is also crucially shaped by the same interests. So, individual debtors making case against all that is practically impossible. So what do we do? In my opinion, it's a matter of leveraging financial power. And how do you do that? Can trade unions do that? Trade unions are and will remain one of the most important pillars in any democratic society, protecting worker rights, protecting workplace democracy, right to different work. But we don't have the legal status or the expertise to fight such a battle, right? So what we need is specialized institutions that can legally do that and have the expertise to do that. And as explained towards the end of the book, that is an institution that has already started emerging, and that is tenant unions and debtor unions in the first place, right? Specialized member-led institutions that can negotiate and can with different forms of financialization. And coordination between the three, should involve a number of things, a number of strategies that can address some of the issues that are just described. So, for instance, synchronized labor, rent, and debt strikes. Organizing all these strikes, these rent and debt strikes, by specific creditor type, specific debt type, to put the same pressure that one can do in workplace disputes, right? Eventually, upon growing in number and size, of course, that could, depending on the country, you claim control over pension funds. It's really important in some countries. Trade unions can negotiate about pension matters, but in other countries, they're not legally allowed to do so. So even pensioners' union might be really important in pursuing further change at this level. And of course, once that all these institutions become large enough, one can, of course, make a case for investing into lobby for higher level policy change, from rent and mortgage caps to wealth taxation and other interventions of this type. But this is one side of the coin. How do we fight back against what already exists? The other question is, what do we do to change that? And again, to me, what is explained at the end of the book, that the answer to this question lies with an institution that we already have, and that is trade unions. We do have small, at the moment, for a very long time, quite small, member-owned, member-controlled credit providers, which, of course, if sufficient savings are being moved into these institutions, will have the capacity and the same principles of endogenous money creation that private for-profit financial institutions do, to expand credit creation and become bigger and bigger. And what can they do? Actually, many things that are already happening to some extent. Strategically buying out defaulted and risky debt portfolios. Right? It sounds kind of crazy, but you can actually buy huge bundles of debt for a fraction of the cost. There was, I was reading just a few weeks ago, there is an organization, not member-led, but an organization in the US that's called Rest in Peace Medical Debt. And they bought, I think, in a crowdfunding campaign, they bought $1.5 million of medical debt for £17,000. So these are bundled and sold in markets that we don't have access to. But once one have the necessary institutions and some money, this can be bought and just, forgive huge amount of debt. Of course, that cannot happen individually. At the same time, once these institutions have enough lending capacity, one can make a case for strategically buying out financial distress firms under the condition of expanding worker representation, or even funding local governments, and try to embed forms of democratic control on public investment, from citizen panels to different types of sortition, and of course support, when these do emerge, scalable worker managed firms that exist for a long time and have survived in many countries for a very long time, right? But of course, I guess the last comment, the last statement I will make before I finish this presentation, that this cannot happen in isolation. All this must happen in a coordinated way at the global level. You can have one country pursuing that, because the financial pressures that we're facing are global. And we can address globalized problems with localized domestic solutions. So yeah, I guess that's the main premise of the whole book. And in case I convinced you about any of this reading more, here comes the so my publisher was very kind to provide a half-price discount for the book in case you're interested to buy the book. But in any case, thank you so much for the attention.
No, there are people online. If you stand there, they can see.
They can see it.
It's up to you.
I can, yeah. I mean, I just go there. I have some comments that I wrote down. I'm really happy that I did. Use my brain of pride. Maybe they're there. So my comments out. So I'll try to be brief. So first of all, I really enjoyed the book, and I think you made a very timely contribution. I'll tell you in a moment why I think it's very timely, it's important, but exploitation for this was already signposting that. The way I understand your central argument is that we cannot understand what I can only describe as the degradation of work, which is very much across sectors, across all levels, only if we look inside the workplace, right? So we also need to look at the financialization of corporations, the state, and crucially of working households, the indebted working class. So one of the book's major achievements is precisely to bring these dimensions together and show that debt is an active mechanism through which labor is disciplined, and I completely agree with that. That's the core insight and the original timely contribution. I especially like the fact that you give us a much richer picture on the future of work and how you make it about the future of workers. So you move beyond the debates that you mentioned, which are narrowly focused on technology, automation, de-skilling, workplace surveillance. These are all very important arguments. But you're showing us that what's at stake goes beyond AI. Indeed, it goes beyond work itself. At stake are workers, their credit, their social reproduction, their insecurity, their very lives. And that's why I very much like, how you frame financialization as exploitation, because Podis is right. The notion of exploitation has fallen off a bit. It's all extraction, but it's not clear how exploitation takes place. I think that the book has a very coherent architecture. The early chapters build the conceptual scaffolding of the argument, and then the later chapters flesh it out with a very rich historical, empirical analysis. That's great. Chapter 2 and 3 are especially pivotal in that sense. Chapter 2 broadens the lens beyond the future of work discussions. And chapter 3 then really does the heavy lifting with the indebted working class. Then the later chapters, you've mentioned how, all of this has implications for trade unions, for the labor market, and for resistance, how we can bring in the politics of labor. That's great. So I think my comments will focus mainly on the earlier chapters, where the framework is being built. And I think it's just the goal of enriching your contribution and adding some points to all layers, perhaps. So first, I very much appreciated how, you put at the core the question of the degradation of work and how this goes beyond the labor process. To understand that, we need to look at changes in corporate governance, financialization. I think this insight very much opens the door to thinking more explicitly about how finance reshapes the non-financial sector. And a lot has been said already. The whole literature on shareholder value maximization has done a lot of that. But you mentioned private equity, and I think that that's really important because private equity in many ways has been a driver in reshaping financial governance. In the 80s, they were called buyout firms, but they were driving this process. So the changes in the governance of non-financial corporations have been sort of like, driven by the rise of these financial actors, which restructure cooperation and cooperation in the process, their disciplined labor. And I think that that's important also because it points to something that has to be stressed. The degradation of work goes alongside the degradation of the firm, because this type of activities, private equity-led activities, very much hollowed out companies, if not zombified some sectors, through like burdening them with debt and so on. So these two things are quite important, because not all corporations have been empowered. The large ones certainly, but the smaller ones, they're actually being degraded, and so has the economy overall. That's that. Moving to chapter 3. So I very much like that, and of course, how you broaden the scopes, beyond de-skilling, beyond automation. I think that's important, because a lot of the discussions just now automation is always there. So moving to chapter 3, the indebted working class. So I agree with a lot of, I agree basically with everything you say, but I want to just raise 3 related points. One on the nature of the neoliberal state, which you discuss in the chapter. The other one on the social composition of household debt, household leverage, and then the other one on the need to disaggregate data further on household debt, and why that's important. So first on the neoliberal state. So we present this familiar story of the neoliberal transition from a welfare state, welfare provision, to private credit financialization, privatized Keynesianism, the idea of a trade-off between welfare state and private debt. And this captures something which is fundamentally real and important. But I'm not fully persuaded by the idea that this has meant small government, which is something, that it's not really, you're just following, the general sort of narrative that you're not focusing too much on the neoliberal state as such. My point, I guess, is that the neoliberal state looks less like a state that has tightened its belt and more like a state that has reoriented its balance sheet. Fiscal capacity. Welfare provisioning has been curtailed, but public debt has grown nevertheless. So governments are still borrowing more than they have ever done, and they do so through crisis management, through bailouts, and more generally through fiscal support for what many call the asset economy, right? Changing tax policies, untaxing capital gains, is a way in which costs are distributed away. Somebody else is footing the bill, the tax bill. And this matters analytically because it suggests that the story is not just one of a state withdrawing and private finance, filling the gap, a trade-off, but of how the state actively reorganizes the terms on which private sector leverage, debt, finance, operates and socializes its costs. So the state is very much, in that sense, also expanding its capacities. And that brings me to the second point. Who's actually empowered to borrow and to what terms, right? Which is part of the work I do. And you, of course, are aware of the objections that have been made that the bulk of household debt consists of mortgages which are actually owed by affluent household, top quintile, not top decile. And you rightly point out that debt should not be assessed in absolute amounts alone, but also in relation to income and assets, right? And this is fair and this is right. It's an important thing to point out. But I think that chapter 3 still leans too heavily towards a generalized image of low-income households being in debt, being incorporated and disciplined by cheap credit, or not so cheap, under neoliberalism. Now, the first difficulty with this claim is that, for instance, when it comes to housing debt, mortgage debt, there has been no major secular expansion of US home ownership since 1980. despite the enormous growth of mortgage credit. That's quite remarkable. The home ownership rate was 65.8% in 1980, and 2025 is 65.7%. So, so this is one thing. That suggests that credit expansion is not functioned as a mechanism to include and subordinate workers under the discipline of debt, although they are by other means, but as a mechanism of asset price inflation, selective access by affluent households, and exclusion of many workers. Because all of this housing inflation, which is debt fueled, has priced out lower income households, pushed them out of neighborhoods, promoting gentrification, forcing them into expensive rental housing. So then a second difficulty is that once we disaggregate the data on household finances, again, we find that upper income, upper wealth households remain very much central drivers of household debt through mortgage borrowing. So the working rich, they're actually the most indebted groups, not just in absolute terms, but also relative to their disposable income, which is quite remarkable. And when you look at debt to disposable income ratios by decile, income decile, you see that not just in the US and the UK, but also in the EU. Actually, in some countries, they're even higher debt to disposable income ratios, like in the Netherlands and Scandinavian countries. So for them, it's not a problem because they borrow to accumulate housing assets. They enjoy low interest rates. They face low debt service burdens, and so on and so forth. So my point is that, you know, for these affluent households, debt is a wealth accumulation strategy, whereas poorer households often is a symptom of exclusion from asset-based accumulation. They can borrow to consume and pay, but they are much less likely to borrow to invest in housing because they have poor credit scoring, low income, poor quality or no collateral. And that brings me to the final point and final main comment, which is the importance of disaggregating household debt, which you do to an extent, as this can help us understand how workers might be disciplined through debt, but perhaps not their own debts, the debts of others. So you do disaggregate, especially looking at race disparities, which is very important, but you know, race is not class. So I think a breakdown by income, wealth, decile, percentile, quintile, you know, that allows us to sort of find this. And there we find that a lot of low-income households are disciplined by consumer debt, very much. Student loans, revolving credit. However, the majority of them, most of them, when we look at the bottom quintiles, they actually don't have a mortgage, and actually sometimes they don't have personal debt at all. Like more than 50% looking at the bottom of the income distribution. And not just like, you know, the bottom quintile, if not the bottom quintiles, like bottom 40%. So for many workers, the decisive discipline may not be a mortgage indebtedness, but their inability to qualify for it, which leaves them exposed to rising rents and predation by their landlords, which are levered up. Because, you know, the tenant is paying the mortgage of their landlord. So they're disciplined by the mortgages of others. And in that sense, I think that the discipline of debt sometimes becomes the discipline of debtors over other debtors. And that sort of forces us also to think a bit about how we democratize, how we resist this, because it's not just about the debts of the workers, which are important, but also the debts of others and how those debts are shifted into costs for workers, even when they don't borrow. They're still debtors of the state, so they still pay taxes and regressive tax regimes. So I'll just close here. I just want to return to the book's broad, big strengths. I think it's rich, ambitious, it's important. You, in the later chapters, you show us and why it is important to bring the politics of labor back the heart of debates on financialization. Because for so long we just think, oh, the wage relation is not important anymore. It's the asset economy which is definitely important, but all the things that you pointed out in your presentation are fundamental. The double pressure on organized labor that you mentioned, how indebtedness raises the cost of industrial action, strikes, how the financialization of everyday life weakens labor's capacity to organize, resist. So all of this is crucial. And for this reason, I really enjoyed your book, and I invite everyone to read it and use that 50% discount.
Thank you, Stefano. I think yours would like to respond, but I think it's best you do so in combination with responding to questions. So let's have some questions from the floor, 2 or 3, and either Giorgos or Stefano can reply, and then we, after that, get some debate going. Any questions? If I don't see any questions, I will come in. Don't force me to come in too soon. Anyone got a question?
There's one online.
Okay.
Ibena.
Okay. Can we hear it?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
May I?
Yes, go ahead. Welcome.
Congratulations. Congratulations on the book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm particularly intrigued by your thesis about debt for industrial peace. Indeed, there has been, at least I'm observing in my writing, a stronger capital labor alliance. This is, sorry. A very important point you're making there. I just, to understand better kind of the flow of your argument, I have 2 very basic questions of clarification. So you approached your entry point in problematizing all this. You say, if we cannot explain inequalities unless we understand the place of financialization, but why should that be our horizon, kind of a normative horizon? I'm asking because Marx was not bothered by inequalities. He was interested in understanding the dynamics of exploitation and alienation, of how capital reproduced itself. And I also understand very well your point generally about the degradation of work and the intensification of work. So I wondered, what is the status of inequalities in your writing? Is this like a normative guideline? What? I just don't see why it's necessary to figure out there. And then you build a dichotomy between, you said it's not anymore about control of the means of production, it's about control of financing. This seems to be an important distinction, and yet for Marx, finance and a means of production were just 2 forms of capital. So what is the big deal of saying, no, it's not about controlled means of production, it's about finance. It's still about control of capital. So what is the important shift I'm missing there? And then you also said, let me look at my notes quickly. Oh yeah, why exploitation? What is triggering exploitation and the deepening of exploitation? Why not content ourselves with the Marxian answer that it is the pursuit of profit and financialization, the liberalization of finance that happened about 3 decades ago was just a tool for intensification of the pursuit of profit. So I don't see the big paradigm shift that you imply that there is there. So if you can clarify this for me. I'm done. Hello? Hello? What happened? Can you hear me? I can't hear a thing.
Okay, I think you can hear us now, probably.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, for Stefano, for the extensive comments. Really appreciate it. Took the time with me and Albina for your comments. Starting with Stefano, I don't agree with anything you said as well. I have to say, of course, yeah, I do agree that this idea that a liberal state is just about the, small government and the full retraction of what the state government spending is not really, doesn't really give the full picture of what is going on. Of course, the state is very active, but it's doing things to enhance its capital mobility and assist private business and also bail them out. They're very expensive loan agreements, of course. We saw that, and that's, I guess, the main premise that they also make towards the end of the book about why we should organize around debt and put this kind of pressure also in the system to avoid the struggles we are dealing with at the moment. I mean, we hear all the time that it's systemic risk whenever big bank is failing. When Trump failed in Atlantic City, his whole casino business went down. The argument was in systemic risk, and it is. It's true. Hundreds, thousands of people are being employed by these organizations. Gonna just let them go down. But at the same time, we should create the conditions that we, as workers in the Marxist sense, I guess, will live out of working, live out of assets, vast majority of us at least, to create through organizing around get the same kind of pressure to the system. About home ownership, yeah, I do agree with that as well. That of course, many people are not indebted, but they do face the consequences of indebtedness. I mean, to just bring a story to all that, I just received before coming here a letter from my landlord to increase my rent because his mortgage payments are going up. So I can feel exactly what you mean. It's true. But it was also shocking is that in some cases, in the US at the moment, there's rent debt because we don't have anymore that many private individual landlords. They're all under some kind of corporate umbrella. And they can now, if you miss a debt payment, that translates directly into debts that you pay interest for. So they're fully passing on the whole cost to you formally as debt. But also I do agree with the whole story that we need to look in more detail at how this works across different income levels, different wealth levels. It's a very complicated story, however. I tried to do that when I started the book. I started digging into this data, and there is variation, of course, from one country to another. But it's kind of difficult when it comes to the super rich to trace down what exactly do they owe, because they don't hold the debt on their own. You have to find what kind of corporations they own, how they borrow through their own corporation. It's quite complicated, separate project, I guess. But I do take the point that if you research all that thoroughly, you can get a more complete picture about this whole thing. But also, what you mentioned about public debt is also true. But again, one can do only so much in 200 pages, so you have to make some choices about what's included and what's not to include. And thank you so much for reading for the book and your comment. Now, Albina's question. Thank you. Thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it. Right. Exploitation and profiting and how does it work in Marxist terms, I guess. When it's said that we need to look at all the means of financing, I don't mean to throw it out the window by any means, all the means of production, right? What I'm trying to make a case is that, we need to understand both in the current environment, because selling, trading firms, selling debt, even private debt, has become tradable assets these days. And if you look, I have a potentially very extensive answer that I didn't include the book because it was looked up later. It was quite extensive and probably separate projects. But if you look at who owns the biggest employers globally and who owns the biggest banks that provide particularly household credit at the moment, you will find the same entities owning both, exploiting people at work in a way, right? Through the classical notion of exploitation as a mark, extracting surplus value. And whatever people get, they also give back to the very same. If you look at all major mortgage providers, student loan providers, auto car loans, healthcare, and also the biggest employers globally, Walmart, Amazon, Foxconn, you see all of them, 7 to 9, in some cases 12%. It's institutional investors, BlackRock, right? State Street Corporation. They own almost everything in terms of credit providers and big employers. So they're profiting, they're exploiting people at work, and at the same time, they're exploiting them for their access to whatever essential needs they need to finance. I guess what is different, slightly different perhaps, compared to the time of Marx is what is described initially about competition, financial competition between firms. So what Marx described for 19th century is inter-firm competition, sectoral competition, has this whole idea of equalization of rate of profit between sectors and how that creates competitive dynamic between firms in the same sector and how capital moves from one to another. But what we observe, at least with big, large corporations these days, is that what they're competing against is, for example, as Forrest, I guess, can explain much better than me, is competing for a position at S&P 500, right? That gives them access to cheaper credit, issue corporate bonds cheaper compared to their more reliable assets, more tradable, more appealing to fund their investment. So this whole situation, the tradability of both private debt, different kinds of corporations has, I guess, perplexed a bit the picture. And to understand these dynamics is not as straightforward as it used to be, right after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so to speak. But of course, yeah, as you saw perhaps in the graphs before, I also engaged with all discussion about the distribution of income between capital and labor, which again, in my opinion, is crucially shaped by financial dynamics these days. Not just about, firms are not suppressing wages to necessarily have higher profit rates, greater market share. What they're trying to do is to deal with financial pressure. They're squeezing wages, extracting more surplus value, which ends up with financial institutions, one way or another, or their own creditors, or their own shareholders. The separation of ownership, management, and production, I guess, is, in my opinion, is substantially and analytically different from what used to be 200 years ago.
Before I take on more questions, I'm going to come in with a comment, and I think you have a comment too. But I think Albina's question goes to the heart of today's debate, central to Giorgos' book. What is the difference today about exploitation compared to Marx's day that comes out of the book, which focuses on debt and financialization? My opinion is this. In Marx's day, you have exploitation in the sense of a surplus produced by a majority of workers appropriated by a minority in the production realm, the realm of the factory and so on. Today, that's been extended. With financialization and debt, you have exploitation not only across space, across time. People are taking out debt in order to be educated and so on. And how many years do they take to pay off the debt, the student loans and so on? Years. This is exploitation across time, not just across space. Extra dimension of exploitation, the appropriation of the surplus from the world's majority by an increasingly vanishingly small. And along with that is, of course, Stephanos' point. Not only exploitation across time, but also the democratization of exploitation, in the sense that it's not just workers, it's also middle income groups. It's just about everyone on the planet, apart from a tiny clique at the very top. The wealth concentration at the top is reaching obscene proportions, never seen before. Right? So we have exploitation across time, and also it's deepening in density. You want to make a comment?
A comment and a question, if I may.
Which order?
Comment and one question.
That's usually the inverse, isn't it? All right,
This
make
is what I have.
and then your question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I've read the book. Very, very nice indeed. Very good. I agree.
What do you agree with?
Everything.
Here's my
So
call.
I just maybe want to, based on the discussion, to make a couple of comments, which are in the book, but just bring some things out, which were kind of said, but maybe highlight them a bit more. So something which is not so much in the book, but it's related to also the colleague online, the colleague's question online. What's their name? Albena's question. So indeed, these two things in capitalism are related. And I mean, there is a Marxist and a post-Keynesian tradition that, you know, makes this very much related, because in a way, if you want to have M, which gives M plus delta M, this delta M must appear from somewhere, right? And this is money, so it must appear, it's new money, it must come from the financial system. So having a financial system is a necessary condition to have MCM prime. This is one point. Second point, it's important to understand why this exists across time. I mean, since the beginning of capitalism, actually before capitalism, this was a condition, and I agree with these people who say, like Ariki and others, that it wasn't like the Industrial Revolution, but capitalism started in Italy, in Venice, actually, because the financial system started there. So I think this is a good point, but it's important to understand how indebtedness after the late 70s has played an important role. Giorgos mentioned lots of things, and the book says lots of things, but I want to highlight a specific aspect using some game theory arguments, right? So these game theory arguments are not mine, they come from Engels and Marx, who used game theoretic arguments. Surprise, surprise. So Engels had it in the book of The Condition of the Working Class, I think, and Marx has it in several texts, but the most known, I think, is chapter 25 of the first volume of Capital, where he talks about the reserve army of labor. Now, in order to have exploitation, you need the workers to agree in some way to get less money than what they produce, right? Where does game theory come in? Why would they do that? So, in the reserve army of labor, what Marx and Engels say is this is related to their outside option. If you have unemployment, then your outside option is nothing. So you're willing to take lower wages, which lead to exploitation, because otherwise you will be unemployed, right? This is the idea. It's the outside option in game theory. Now, I think financialization, as Giorgos has developed in his presentation and in the book, the theory, does not go against the reserve army of the unemployed, but actually builds on this, strengthens the pressure that they have. So it can be thought as minimizing the outside options. Something that I say, so they said, you know, workers have nothing to lose but their chains. And this is where your comment comes in. If you borrow from the future, because it's across time, right? So you borrow money to get a house because the bank thinks that you will pay back, on average, not you, it doesn't care, it's a statistical thing. From the future, you will repay. So you get your future income today, which gives you house, car, education, healthcare, a number of things that have been taken away. So your outside option is not losing just your wage, but losing all these things and the ability to get them again, because you will have a very bad credit score. So then this makes you more vulnerable. So in the same way, I think that the reserve army of the unemployed makes you more vulnerable because you have a bad outside option. In a similar way, your outside option is worse of this. So I think this Marxist and Engels game theoretic idea fits. So understanding financialization now helps us understand this type of aspect. And then my question, so this was the comment. My question, which is for all of you who know much more than me. So this kind of project, let's say globalization, financialization, neoliberal project that started from the late 70s, it started because of a crisis of capital, right? Or a crisis of capitalism. This is a way to go beyond this from the capitalist point of view. Now we have another crisis. Maybe it's two crises, maybe it's the same crisis since 2008. We have a poly crisis, people call it. So things are not going very well for capitalism, right? So what does this mean for financialization? Do you think, the people who know more than me, that we are in the end of this process? Does it transform? Does it change? Will we see a continuation of this process with a different phase? Will we see something different, or will not predict the future?
It's a very broad question, which we'll come to in a moment. But if anyone else want to ask questions before I'm going to ask
comments?
Anyone?
I would have a question, but
It's
not fully developed. It's more like, what I kept wondering, what is the role of monetary policy in all this, especially in a country like the UK, where basically monetary policy works through the housing market, which is insane. Not if it works through the rich, but of course it doesn't. It works through the middle class, if anything. So if they finally have their house and now interest rates increase, they are supposed, this lower middle class and middle class is supposed to reduce their spending. And that is how monetary policy works, which is, of course, insane. But my main question is, what happened in all these years where interest rates were really low? And does this, to some extent, work against your argument, because then there could have been a lot of space of, oh, I'm going to take on this mortgage because it basically costs very little. I'm just wondering if that adds to the flavor of your argument.
Anyone else? Before you come in, and Stefano, because your question you ended with overlaps your concluding remarks in your presentation about the necessity for global coordinated action. And at the moment, the global institutions such as we have, WTO, the United Nations, are under threat from Trump, being gutted, muted, and so on. Unless we reverse that process and strengthen these institutions, the situation is going to get worse. 9 billion people on the planet. If you add to financialization, globalization, technology, you have job transfer, as you say, job transfer to the East, to China, and unless there is global coordination, it's going to get worse. And what I liked about the presentations, the two, Giorgos and Stefan, is putting debt at the center of what's going on today in addition to the whole pressures of work, intensification of work, industrial reserve army and so on. Debt is the key element in today's modern financialized era. Debt weighing down, making you insecure, worried about you can't lose your job, how are you going to pay your debt, how are you going to pay off your loans and so on. So, you know, I think this is what's come out of your book presentation, the centralization of debt in today's era of global exploitation, what needs to be done. Now, unless anyone else got questions, I'm going to ask Giorgos and Stefanos to come back and say something. I don't know
if Albena has another question. She still has her hand
up.
Another
people with questions.
There's another hand up?
No, I forgot. No.
Albena, come in.
Somebody else as well?
No, I forgot. Sorry. Go ahead.
Is there anyone else online?
Yeah.
AG.
Alexander.
Yeah? Hi.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Giorgos. Thanks so much for the presentation. I really like the presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I have a bit maybe of a cheeky question. It's something that I've been trying to understand as well, also with my own research on financialization. And it's a little bit, it's related to the comments that were made previously in the terms of what is different. You've kind of put up a bit of a grand narrative here with financialization, right? Where finance is working through, say, for example, industrial capitalists, putting pressure on industrial capitalists, pushing pressure on workers. And so the answer that quite often is given is, okay, this goes a little bit into the direction of Albena's question. You know, is it really a conflictuous relationship between industrial capitalists or financial capitalists, or are they actually aligned here? And this leads me, I suppose, to my more general question, which is, to what extent can we really make a causal claim when it comes to financialization? So to what extent is it more something that is happening in the background in the context of tendencies of capitalism to exploit workers anyways? In what extent can it be something like what I think it was Giorgos Galanis, well, I couldn't see his face, but I recognized his voice, was asking about, okay, it may contribute to an exploitative process that is already ongoing. And to what extent are we maybe exaggerating its significance here? In the sense of, is this a factor, a small factor that is contributing? It's incredibly difficult for us to isolate its causal evidence in empirical analysis, because it's about quite often a sentiment change rather than a kind of shock that actually happens where we can try to estimate the causal effect. So I'm curious how secure you are about this grand narrative in a way, just to hear. But I really love the presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Thank you.
Albena, did you want to come in with another question or comment? Albena?
No, I just love this last question, Alexander. Great. Yes, so let's hear it. Let's hear the answer. No, I have no other question.
Elisa?
Yes, I would like also to discuss, if we have time to discuss a bit more about why workers have accepted all this. Giorgos previously said about a game, which sounded a bit of a closed game, as if it's work or being unemployed, as if there is no other alternative. Then Fotis said about, and of course at the end of your presentation, about the global coordination. And I think this is also a very strong point of your book. I haven't read it yet entirely, but I'm really looking forward to it, that it opens the discussion about what else can happen. How can we really change it? And I don't know, is the organization of the unions enough as it is now to give some radical answers to change that completely?
Anyone else along here? Stefan, you want to come in?
Questions for Giorgos?
No.
I think I give the space to.
Yeah, he will, but he's made some comments you've heard. I was wondering if you had any observations.
if anything, to add to the comment made that on, what's happening now and financialization coming to an end, or what the system. I think it's important to bear in mind that in the 70s there was a crisis of capitalism because there was a crisis of profitability. Right? Profit rates went down dramatically, whereas in this first quarter century, 21st century, especially in the last 10 years, so including in the last 5 years, so very high volatility, but also very high profit rates. Actually, corporate profit rates have reached a historic peak in the 2010s. And, once again, in the greedflation wave of 21, 23. So I think, financialization for the system to be forced into some transformation, you need to first get to the point where the profits are the profit rates and the profit margins go down dramatically. I don't know, maybe this is going to happen now with the second energy shock, with war in Iran, who knows? But might not be crisis time still for capitalism. It's still doing quite a bit of money. You conclude, I think it's important, to talk about, what can be done, this question of democratizing finance, this question of resisting. I think, these are very important questions on how to organize. And, I think that workers' organization and reviving, the strength of trade unions is crucial, but it's also very much of as you showing us all these structural impediments to it. So I think that, the real challenge there is, at least, the way I see it, is how we sort of try and resist these forms of financial accumulation, which are often taking place through using the financial system not as a lending machine, but as a borrowing machine, again. So, to me, that remains really central, because it's to really fund society, we need to defund the rich in the first place, right? So that's the real challenge. I don't know what we'll get there.
Thanks everyone for the Yeah, is capitalism going to collapse? I don't think so. It's quite profitable. It works quite well. I mean, the reality is when things go wrong, we do see emergency intervention. We saw it in COVID, right? Finally, what furlough schemes, landlords couldn't evict people. They knew very well. I mean, it was a very unique situation, of course. We've never had that for hundreds of years. There's a pandemic. But, the state, several states, didn't stay small and actively intervened to temporarily stabilize the system. That's what always happens. But that didn't happen actually in the golden age of capitalism, so to speak. You meet the same process. We had different dynamics, different underlying pressures, economic and political pressures, but still, there's always some kind of intervention to stabilize the system and keep going for a little bit until the next crisis and so on. But yeah, the reality is that if you let capitalism completely free, that's what you get, basically. We live in the most globalized, interconnected, financialized version of the world economy ever, right? Technological change, transportation, communication, finance is more interconnected than ever. We're as close as we can be probably to perfect capital mobility, as in whatever mainstream economic models we were taught during our undergrad, right? So yeah, I guess even when things go wrong, we had some kind of intervention to stabilize the system, which is why I make the case in the last chapter, I guess, about why we need some kind of strategy about more permanent changes. Say we somehow, now we have some I don't know, Mamdani or someone else, right? And he forgives all debt. Nothing else changes, though. It will keep rising again. We'll be in the same place in a few years. Okay, the underlying conditions that create the need for debt are there, right? And financial institutions have the capacity to lend for all those purposes. Even things that payday loans, for example, are legal in the States, are not luckily legal here anymore. if you let the financial system free, that's basically what you get. You will find how to profit. Like I described, this is short discussion in the book, of course, about gender, race, ethnicity. It will finance capital is very effective in finding who is the profiting from it. That's the whole logic of the system. I'm not sure if all that answered your question exactly, but in the interest of time, and to avoid Flori's complaining that we're late to the pub, monetary policy, I do, particularly in the UK, it's a big thing, of course. Yeah, it's a society of, we live in a society here of middle-class landlords, right? Which they vote, unlike the super rich in the US. It's a substantial voting population, middle-class landlords. So, yeah, to a great extent, government policy, monetary policy, especially with regards to mortgages, is dictated by electoral dynamics in this country, the middle-class electoral dynamics. And yeah, of course, once you enter, in the past at least, mortgage agreement at a very low interest rate, you end up with variable interest rate or rising interest rates, and you're, in a few years, you're deeply in debt or insolvent. It's true. That's how things work. Slightly different in other countries where land ownership and housing, real estate is more concentrated at the top, like the US or Australia, for instance. But still, monetary policy does play a role in terms of an electoral purpose, particularly in countries like the UK. Yeah, Alex question. Thanks, man. I guess we're discussing these things 10 years now since we're doing our PhDs. I guess what is different to me, a substantive shift is, we do live in this, as I mentioned before, a very interconnected, globalized world in terms of finance and communication, more than ever before, right? So I guess there's a breakdown between who is financial capital, who is capital. In the past, you had people like Engels, for example. He owned a factory in Manchester. To sell this thing back in the day, you would need to negotiate with whatever buyer you had and do all this whole thing. It's very costly because now you have listed corporations, right? And trade. Who is actually the owner? So I think what is substantial, it's a little different, is that you have a full breakdown these days of who owns the corporation, in terms of shares, for instance, who manages the corporations, and who actually works for the corporation. What do managers do? They try to balance the two sides, right? And to me, that's kind of unique, if I'm honest. They're trying, on the one hand, to try to pursue whatever are the actual goals of their corporation, create whatever service or product they have to, but at the same time, they need to attract capital. And very often, it's not a straightforward process. So in many cases, they're kind of exploiting. You don't have the capitalist exploiting the worker. You have the manager exploiting the worker on behalf of the capitalist and the potential investor. And you have these investors getting whatever returns they want, and then they sell the shares and whatever they have. I mean, this tradability of the corporation, I guess it's unique, I think. At least that's my view. We never had that to that extent, probably ever. And final question, well, why do we get in debt? Because we cannot do anything else, I guess. You need to be, in some cases, you don't even have an option, right? It's always good, I guess, to take more extreme examples about what happens in the US, for instance, right? Fully privatized healthcare system. You can slip on the road, break your leg, an ambulance will come and get you. They will not ask questions, and you will get a bill after your operation, whatever, how many you owe, whatever you owe. No questions asked. The same is true also for other stuff as well, right? You have the option. Do I go to the labor market directly after school, if the school is, of course, free, or do I get a degree? And what's your option? To enter the labor market directly at a lower wage and remain less skilled, so to speak, whatever skill is, and keep getting exploited for the rest of your career, or pay a huge amount of money to get a degree, even here now, and get a job, but get exploited by your creditor, like You will have to pay a huge amount of money for the rest of your career, probably, to whoever lend you money. And that's true for all different things. And again, think about housing, for instance. If you have the capacity to borrow, it's cheaper to buy a house or a flat as opposed to renting. So you're being pushed to get into debt. And of course, that then comes the monetary policy aspect, right? As we mentioned. You enter a specific agreement, something happens like now, wars, COVID, whatever, inflation goes up, interest rates goes up, you end up with a much more expensive loan than you expected it to be. You have no control over that, so to speak. And can unions do enough? I guess, as explained in the book, no, because they don't have, again, the legal capacity, the legal standing, the expertise to do so. There's two different relations. I mean, legally, unions can negotiate only about labor disputes, workplace issues. They cannot go negotiate with the bank very well. So we do need, and that's why these kind of institutions do emerge, right? Even we have the London Renters Union. We have other forms of debtor unions across the world, amazing, small, still very small. But that shows the need, there's a substantial need for people to negotiate about these matters. And it's something unions cannot do on their own. But however, it's true that unions sit on a lot of money in many cases, but they don't invest. They're kind of holding back. They have low membership. They don't invest into organizing. And I guess to attract members, they will have to invest in broader organizing. Other types of unions grow more. And again, I said, coordinate action. That's the only way to address some of the deadlocks I described earlier, I guess. And I made it to 6:30.
Perfect. I'd like to thank two speakers, Giorgos and Stefanos discussion. I think they laid the foundation for what I thought was a very interesting discussion. I'm hoping as a consequence of this, everyone who hasn't already got the book will buy it, and it's a very good price. Some of the prices you see, talk about debt. Buying a book these days puts you into that. So please buy the book, but I think you'll agree with me. We've had a very interesting discussion and debate presented by our two speakers. So can we give a round of applause for the two speakers?
It's great.
You're always great.
The code again for the discount?
As I said, I'm not prepared to come to the public part because I feel a little bit under the weather.